in Boston to go behind the scenes to hear some untold stories about the making of Bioshock with Ken Levine and Sean Robertson. Let's talk a bit about the theme and setting of Bioshock, Rapture. I think a lot of people, when they played the game for the first time, Ken, they wondered, how did you even dream up this place? And I know you've said publicly before that part of the reason you sort of, what led you to Rapture was this idea of fully simulating a place. Tell us about that sort of idea and the frustrations you had with other games where you sort of hit a bound.
I think our philosophy was always to do what we were doing 100% rather than try to do something bigger and do it 50% or 40%. So one of the ideas of, and this sort of came from System Shock 2 as well, where you focus on an area that you can really bring to life and you kind of eliminate the questions of, well, why can't I go over the bridge to New Jersey? So we were able to really make a place, I think, that felt believable and real, even though in actuality it was really quite limited. But we just sort of dressed it with all these buildings outside that were all, were all basically glorified fakes. We let the story drive what we needed to show rather than some kind of like predetermined map which we set down, which is a little different than like System Shock 2, where we actually mapped a spaceship out deck by deck. Yeah. Because I don't know why the philosophy felt a little different there, because you want to feel like a real spaceship that was sort of stacked on top of each other. Rapture was free to sprawl across the ocean floor.
Although you guys originally, Sean, were talking about doing this game on a sort of spaceship again, right?
Yeah, when we first started talking about what the spiritual successor to System Shock 2 is going to be, Spaceship came up, but again, we wanted a limited environment and we didn't necessarily want to do Spaceship again. And our first actual exploration of this space was underwater, but ultimately ended up looking like a spaceship. It just happened to have a couple of seaweed fronds outside. And that started to push us towards what artistic statement that we wanted to make this look different, and what rules we were going to set for the world. How at every turn we were going to try to remind the player that they were in fact underwater and that this wasn't a spaceship.
And how, like, underwater, we obviously know you did underwater, then sitting in the sky, like where did you come with the idea of like doing this underwater?
I think there was probably a conversation. It's like, well, what kind of places could be cut off from other places? Yeah. Like, well, spaceship, summer camp, any island notion, right? Something that's cut off from the rest of the world. Yeah. So you never felt like you should be able to go over that bridge to New Jersey.
I don't want to apply some deep and meaningful conversation. I think it was one of those ideas that you just kind of say, and then everybody's, that sounds cool, let's try that. Let's go for it.
And I think it lended itself to having very nice views out the window without having to build an insane amount of unique assets.
Right.
By today's standards, we still were a small team back then. And there's an expectation that because you're underwater, the view distances are going to be short, so you can really kind of fade out into the fog at a short distance and not have the expectation that, why can't I see forever? So there's a lot of limitations in a good way that we put on ourselves by being underwater, as opposed to, like, if you're on a cruise ship, then you'd expect to see across the water and we'd have to deal with that. Same thing with an island.
Or a city in the sky.
Yeah, exactly.
Which was a lot more complicated, yeah.
So you came up with the idea of, let's do this underwater, let's do this sort of isolated place. Then you had to answer the question of, why would someone build this? Is that sort of how it worked, sort of order of operations? You then had to come up with a story to explain?
Yeah, I think we wanted a very believable reason why they'd be there. Right. And sort of the necessary isolation of the place sort of led to, well, what kind of person would want to do this? And I wasn't even particularly aware of the sort of political implications of what I was reading, but I've been reading, I had read The Fountainhead. Right. By Ayn Rand, and I mostly thought it was an interesting story. Like, I didn't realize that people were sort of basing their sort of political lives around it, because I wasn't that tuned in to that stuff at that point. And so, but I love the dialogue and the kind of speechifying in it, because you can see a video game character speaking with that kind of certainty and that kind of confident philosophy. It just seemed like a natural kind of thing to apply to this place. And so it just sort of all came together as a sort of who is the guy who would do this? Well, that character He was sort of this amalgamation of characters from Ayn Rand's books and Ayn Rand herself. This sort of idealistic person who says, well, the only way to do this is to separate from the rest of the world. And that led to Andrew Ryan.
I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone.
We knew from a technical standpoint that we wanted isolation. We also knew to sell it, we needed a compelling storyline, a backstory that why would this place exist? Otherwise, how are we going to make Rapture feel like it's lived in if we don't have the reason for it to be there? So once we decided on the underwater location and then the closed off spaces, that objectivist story kind of came in and made the art stronger and made the level design stronger because we could feed back into that loop.
And I think that's why we had to have sort of Andrew Ryan's pitch right at the beginning of the game. We wanted people to understand why somebody would go there. And so he makes this very personal one-to-one pitch to the gamer, but also that was the pitch you make to people, which was, you know, there's a place that you can be free of all these things, where you can not be sort of put upon by the government and not be afraid of nuclear war and not be afraid of all these other things that will plague you on the surface. We wanted that pitch to sort of resonate and make sense, because that's, otherwise by the time you got there you'd be like, well, this place is just fantasy, nobody would ever come here. And that the beauty of the place also was also tied into that. It had to be a very attractive proposition, or people who would believe that people would go leave their lives and go to the bottom of the ocean.
I'm sure in some ways you had to convince the team and enroll them in your sort of vision of, you know, who this character was going to be and what the setting was going to be. How did that work, Sean? I mean, did Ken come in and say, hey, I've been reading these books, and I think we could sort of...
I believe he just came in one day on a horse and said, Ayn Rand, everybody read The Fountainhead.
Exactly. I bought 30 copies of
Yeah, I think, you know...
Here's a 2,000-page book or something. Yeah. Go read it.
I mean, really it was more organic. You know, like I said, we knew that we had this location, and you struggle to fill it with stories, and you struggle to find meaning of why does this place exist, you know? What's my motivation? And as Ken started to explore Ayn Rand a little more and started talking to us about it, and we were having that conversation, and it's like, oh, this could totally work. Like, this is exciting. Like, this is something that really hasn't been done in a video game before. And if we had flipped it and come up with the idea first before the location, I don't think we would have really been that excited about it. But we had a location, and now we're trying to fill it with that story. And because of the order of operation there, you start to get excited, like, oh, I could totally make this work. This is going to really make it feel like a lived-in space.
You know, as you think of sort of the, you know, the setting, and you think of maybe a character or something, was there a moment that you think back, it's like, oh, like right then and there, like I got excited when you attached the Ayn Rand
For me,
stuff
it was
to
it was going to Rockefeller Center and seeing the visual.
Uh-huh.
So I told this story before, but my wife and I were in New York, and we went to Rockefeller Center, which was, if you go to Rockefeller Center, it basically looks exactly like Rapture. It's because every building, you're sort of encircled. It's this block in New York, or a couple of blocks in New York, where Radio City Music Hall is, and where 30 Rockefeller Plazas, where you see that show 30 Rock, and the ice skating rink, and where they put the Christmas tree, and it's this very iconic location. But what's cool about it, it's all one, unlike the rest of the city. Everywhere you look, it's one architectural style. It's Art Deco, and it's very iconic Art Deco. And my wife and I were there, and we were sort of working on the game, and we didn't have a visual style. And all of a sudden, I started looking around, and I said, oh, this could be a visual for the game. Also, the geometry of it was actually quite conducive to making a video game, because it wasn't overly complicated geometry. Art Deco is quite
bold and simple.
Bold and geometric, yeah, and simple. And so my wife and I bought a couple of tourist cameras this was before iPhone cameras, exactly. You know.
Throwaway cameras,
yeah, throwaway cameras with little Kodak things, and we just started photographing doorknobs and light fixtures, and just sort of developed the photos. Remember that? Brought them in and said,
"Come to the office. Here's a stack of stuff,
here's a
Sean.
Stack of photos. Take a look. I'll see you guys in a couple of years. Go make this."
City where the artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. And with the sweat of your brow, Rapture can become your city as well.
So you had kind of a theme, you came up with an art style, some of the iconic characters, and then, you really had to build the narrative around it. And you've talked about, a lot of the themes in the game and, greed, jealousy, sex, violence, all the things that sort of, drive us or what destroy us. And that was something I think that, as you thought about the story of the game, you wanted to, I'm sure, reflect some of those, right? Because I think people love the characters, it's sort of flawed in a way, and this is a world which is its own little microcosm, but had a lot of tension inside of it.
Yeah, I mean, the character of Ryan was sort of, he's basically invisible through most of the game, right? Except for a very small portion. But he's very present because he exists, the city is him, right? It's such a representation of him. We never want to cut away to a cutscene where you saw Andrew Ryan, planning and scheming. We wanted him to be very present without actually being present. But once you had Ryan, once you had his desire to protect this vision of his, you just had to then come up with the characters who'd be arrayed in opposition to him. So we had this character, the Big Daddy, and then eventually the character of the Little Sister. And so characters like Tenenbaum came along, like, here's a person who's in opposition to him for this reason. And then you have, for more noble reasons. And then you have a character like Atlas, who's much more cynical opposition. Once we had all those characters arrayed, we're like, well, who are you? And, you ended up being a sort of, a pawn in the middle of all this opposition to Ryan. We just kept sort of homing in on that theme and making sure that you weren't, eventually figuring out that you couldn't just be here by an accident, that you're an integral part of this story, even though you don't know you're an integral part of this story. You think you're just there by happenstance.
Look, Mr. Bubbles, it's an angel. I can see light coming from his belly. Wait a minute, he's still breathing. It's all right.